Often overshadowed by other civil rights leaders, John Lewis was one of the most tenacious activists in the civil rights movement. He devoted his life to taking a stand against injustice, oppression, and discrimination. Because of his dedication to nonviolent protests, major civil rights legislation was passed. Today he is known as the Conscience of Congress, where he continues to stand up and speak out against inequality. Born in Troy, Alabama on February 21, 1940, John Lewis was raised on the family farm in Pike County. The racial climate encountered by John Lewis as a boy started with the forced migration of Africans to the Americas in the 1600s. Enslaved in brutal bondage for 250 years, a divided nation, 1861 to 1865, a bloody civil war. The victorious North, dreams of Reconstruction, times of despair, Supreme Court decisions. 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, Supreme Court decision validated segregation laws creating second-class status for Black Americans. Daily, young John encountered this second-class status. Jim Crow laws touched every aspect of his life. Economically, in 1950, the average income for blacks was 35% of a white man's salary. In Alabama, 520,000 blacks were not qualified to vote. Opponents of black voting rights used violence and economic threats to discourage blacks from voting. Therefore, they had no political power. The black church provided a cultural refuge against the social, political, and economic storms confronting blacks. During the 1940s and 50s, events occurred that began to change the political and social climate of the United States. Some of these events were inspiring, and some were not. Immediately, there was strong opposition to the Brown decision by Southern white leaders. On March 12, 1956, the Southern Manifesto was introduced in Congress. The document was signed by 101 Southern congressmen. John Lewis was greatly affected by the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. Then he realized there needed to be a change. 3 years later, he arrived in Nashville, Tennessee, the home of 4 African-American colleges. Immediately, he became involved in the nonviolent workshops conducted by Dr. James Lawson. Through these workshops, Lewis realized nonviolent resistance was the answer. For months, students practiced the nonviolent techniques. Finally, on February 13, 1960, students walked in silence to the segregated lunch counters. This was the beginning of the Nashville sit-ins. Initially, the sit-ins were not violent, but on February 27th, angry mobs attacked the nonviolent activists. When the police arrived on the scene, they arrested the protesters. Due to the unending sit-ins and economic boycotts in spring of 1960, 6 downtown restaurants opened their lunch counters to blacks for the first time. This was a victory for the nonviolent resistance. Lewis knew there were many more battles to fight. He would be there even if it meant death.
And in spite of all of this, I had to keep loving the people who denied me service, who stared at me.
In 1961, Lewis was one of the 13 original Freedom Riders who were arrested after angry mobs beat them and set their buses on fire. As the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1963, Lewis was named one of the Big Six leaders, which included Dr. Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph, to organize the March on Washington. Lewis gave an inspiring speech. At age 23, he was the youngest speaker.
How long can we be patient? We want our freedom and we want it now.
Following the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson became the 36th President of the United States and a strong advocate in the fight for civil rights. The following year, Lewis had helped recruit more than 1,000 out-of-state volunteers to work with thousands of black Mississippians to register disenfranchised voters. Many white residents resented the attempt to change the political and social climate in Mississippi. As soon as the young volunteers arrived, there were vicious attacks. On June 21, 1965, 3 of the workers were kidnapped. Their bodies were found 4 months later. More determined than ever, the volunteers pressed on. blacks across the South were registered to vote for the first time. This was known as Freedom Summer. And then there was Selma. Lewis became nationally known during a planned nonviolent march from Selma to Montgomery. Lewis and 600 nonviolent marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. At the end of the bridge, they were ordered by Alabama state troopers to disband. As they stopped to pray, police discharged tear gas and beat the demonstrators. Lewis's skull was fractured. Before Lewis was taken to the hospital, he appeared on national television calling on President Johnson to intervene. The nation watched the brutal attacks. These images proved to be too powerful to ignore, and the day became known as Bloody Sunday. As a consequence, it became a major turning point in the civil rights movement that would impact the political and social climate of the entire nation. During the 1960s, John Lewis was there. He sat in the segregated lunch counters. He rode the buses. He spoke at the march. He recruited for Freedom Summer, and he was beaten in Selma. These events would lead to passage of major civil rights legislation: the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Lewis and other leaders of SNCC like Diane Nash, James Bevel, and Angelina Butler were the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Their actions opened a path for others to become involved in politics, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who led the Mississippi Freedom Party to challenge the traditional Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention.
I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook?
After years of encountering political and violent resistance from segregationists as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis encountered his greatest opposition from within the organization. Stokely Carmichael challenged nonviolence, calling instead for Black power. In May of 1966, Carmichael replaced Lewis as chairman. The election of Carmichael labeled nonviolence as a dying philosophy. Lewis had faith in the principles of nonviolence, but SNCC had abandoned them. In 1981, Lewis ran for political office and became a city councilman in Atlanta. In 1986, Georgia's 5th District elected him its U.S. Congressman. Today, Congressman Lewis is serving his 15th term in the House of Representatives. He still has a vision for nonviolent social change. To help children understand the legacy of the civil rights movement and the impact of nonviolence, Lewis created a trilogy of graphic memoirs titled March. As a result, he received special recognition such as the National Book Award for Youth and the Coretta Scott King Award. June 22, 2016, on the floor of the House, Congressman Lewis led a sit-in to try to force gun control legislation following the June 12 Orlando, Florida attack. He received praise and opposition for this act. In 2016, the Supreme Court weakened the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so the battle for equality continues. In January of 2017, once again, Lewis garnered praise and opposition on his choice not to attend the inauguration of Donald Trump. In Congress, John Lewis was the primary sponsor for 15 bills and a huge advocate for the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
This project would not and could not have happened without his drive, his energy, and his optimism.
In addition, he has received numerous awards for his activism during the civil rights movement and his time in the United States Congress, such as the Medal of Freedom and the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolence Award. But most importantly, he helped create the legacy of nonviolent protests for social change that still continues today. He was there, and he is still there.
When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something, to say something, and not be quiet.